Today I speak with Alon Yakter, who's professor and faculty member at Tel Aviv University and also co-investigator of the Peace Index, which was set up in the 90s during the Oslo peace process to better understand where Israeli society stands vis-a-vis peace with the Palestinians. Alon, thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work with the Peace Index? And of course, October 7th probably changed the mindset and public opinion tremendously. But where was Israeli society before October 7th with regards to peace with the Palestinians and the two-state solution?
Yeah, so thank you. I'll say a few words on the Peace Index. I'm carrying the mantle of previous generations in the 1990s when the Oslo peace process started in 1994. Basically, there was an initiative of running surveys on a monthly basis. We're just monitoring and asking the same questions about support for negotiations, practical belief that this can actually lead to peace with the Palestinians, and then a rotating set of questions on that month's events. In the past few years, we've been running this every few months, but this series has been going on for 3 decades almost. Trying to monitor basically Israeli society, mostly the Jewish part of it. And now we're using the series to just keep track, especially in the last few years. And this leads to, so where does Israelis, especially Jewish Israelis, stand on the two-state solution and the peace process? So starting in the mid-2000s, and especially after Hamas won the Palestinian elections in the mid-2000s, took over the Gaza Strip, we see an ongoing erosion in the willingness or support of Israeli Jews to negotiate with the Palestinians. We see an even bigger drop in the belief that this would lead anywhere. So the split in Palestinian leadership, the way Israelis see it at least, and this tag of Hamas, which is associated in the Israeli mindset with paramilitary terrorism activity, not a legitimate political actor, led to this ongoing decline in support for the two-state solution. And yet, nevertheless, even throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, we still see a very slim majority, or it plays around the 50% if you include Arab, Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel. We've been seeing it going below 50% in the last year or two. What happened now, so this is how we were entering October 7th. Essentially, Israelis feel very, I don't want to say comfortable with the status quo. They don't like the status quo because we asked about that too, but they don't see urgency. They're not sure how to solve this. But we also asked about other solutions that were even less popular. So this could either be a full one state equal rights solution from the left, but also annexation from the right. There's not a lot of support for that in Israeli society. It's only in more extremist factions. What happened on October 7th, we ran a survey on September, and then we used that to run a survey late October, early November, so a couple of weeks after the events. And what we saw was a very sharp decline, unprecedented, basically, since 1994 in support for negotiation. So this event, we saw these small declines in past violent cycles. We never saw such a sharp decline. This matches the magnitude of the events. Yeah, so Israeli Jews in particular are not interested in negotiating right now with the Palestinians, and you can count on one hand basically the number of respondents in surveys who say that there's any chance of peace in the next few years.
And from your experience looking at this data set that runs through, 3 decades, as you mentioned, with every cycle of violence, there's a decline. But is this decline sustained afterwards, or does it sort of go back up? And I guess, of course, I'm not going to ask you to project, but do you think that this particular trend will also run through after the war ends and the dust settles?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I actually done some research on that using pretty advanced statistical tools, the sort you use for stock market trends, right? Because we have monthly trends over years and years and years. And what we saw is that actually these cycles are typically very short. Even during the second intifada, in the Al-Aqsa intifada in the early 2000s, when there were suicide bombs in the middle of Israeli cities. Certainly during the last few violent cycles with Hamas in the last few years, what we've seen is that Israelis become slightly more skeptical and hawkish, but that disappears within a month or two. So within a survey or two, we see everyone go back, revert to their cycles. And the best explanation we have is that, you know, this reaction is very guttural. It comes from the gut. People's blood cool down, so to and then they go back to their old preferences. What we did see in the same research was that the big long-term changes were actually not due to violence, but actually due to political events. So Hamas's victory, for example, or the collapse of various negotiations, even Trump's election. When Trump was elected, it made a slight change because Israelis suddenly felt that they have an ally who would back everything they would say. This had a much longer fingerprint on Israeli public opinion than these violent cycles. And that's why, so that's what we saw so far. And in a way, it was almost optimistic because it means that violence doesn't derail things completely. But that only serves to emphasize the uniqueness of this moment. The Israelis, this is a very big break. We never saw such a big break. We already passed the 1 month, 2 months threshold about now. We don't see any reversion so far. And there's a very strong aversion of any talk about long-term solutions right now, certainly peaceful ones. But also the war is still ongoing. We're used to having two-week cycles and
the war is still ongoing. So you talked about primarily Jewish Israelis, but of course, as you mentioned, there's also a significant Arab Israeli population. Some of them are Muslim, some of them are Christian. How do they poll differently, if they do? Do they follow the same trend? And where do they stand in today's polling?
So the Palestinian citizens of Israel are a fascinating population because we did a survey a year ago. There was parallel in Israel and in Israeli society and Palestinian society, together with Khalil Shkaki who's on the Palestinian territories. And what we saw was that Palestinian citizens of Israel are the most optimistic group of all groups in all areas. They're the ones who remain the most ardently supportive of a two-state solution. They think it's feasible. They think it's doable. Palestinians in the territories are way more skeptical and hostile. Israeli Jewish are way more skeptical and hostile. And that was a break we saw for a while. Palestinian society within Israel are very supportive of such initiatives and this path moving forward. They're more supportive of that than a one-state solution in that regard. They're very comfortable in their position. They want to see this solved. What we saw now was something that we haven't seen before. There were some surveys also published in Israeli media that have shown that Palestinian citizens of Israel were as shocked as Jewish Israelis by these events. We know there were victims from that sector as well. There were Bedouin citizens living in the south that were taken hostage, that were killed, some of them while showing that they were Muslim. So there was a big shock. And what we saw in surveys was a shift toward a more Israeli identity. So there's actually a growing distance. Less Palestinian Israelis are said that their Palestinian identity is the main one, and more of them feel more Israeli as their primary identity. So this sense of shared faith suddenly raises its head here. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming across all Palestinian society, but we never saw such a trend. There's actually a lot of distance from these actions by Hamas. But at the same time, we also see that when you ask about the goals of the war, Israeli Jews are very interested in the two main goals that the government defined, which is returning the hostages and eradicating Hamas. Palestinian citizens of Israel are highly supportive of getting the hostages back. They're more split on what to do with Hamas, and a lot of them are still more sympathetic of what's going on in Gaza than Jewish society.
But are the questions clear enough to indicate their sympathy for the Palestinian people? Because I'm sure some of them also have friends and family versus the, Hamas.
Right. So I'll be more accurate. In terms of the goals of the war, they are less interested in eradicating Hamas, reshaping the regime in Gaza, and all, creating a buffer zone so there won't be more attacks. The sort of language we hear a lot from the government and among mainstream Israeli Jewish society. We do see a lot of talk about the hostages and we do see a non-trivial amount, a double-digit share that do support these goals, the other more hawkish goals as well. I'm not sure I've seen too many questions asking in depth about sympathy to Gazans as opposed to Hamas that make that distinction. But we know there's slightly less enthusiasm about that aspect of the war and its cost.
And so one last question, and I think that this goes back to how the political situation in Israel has also been significantly impacted by October 7th. How does Israeli society today look at the leadership? Because this has been named an intelligence failure by many people within Israel's security establishment and by various, analysts in that field. So where do people stand on that aspect of it? Sort of the leadership in Israel that currently, is headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been at the helm for about a decade.
So Netanyahu right now is in the lowest point he has ever been since he entered politics in Israel. Right now, about 20-25% consistently across multiple polls support him remaining prime minister after the war is done. The main split among the other 80% is whether he should resign immediately or after the war ends. But this does not mean that Israelis moved back to the center or left. This links together two types of criticism. One from the center and left joins a growing crisis that was around democratic backsliding and the judicial reform in the past year and the extremity of the current government. And these people are just are still upset with him, so they're even more upset now. And here the main narrative is he deserted, his concept failed, his entire framework of supporting Hamas failed, of splitting the Palestinian leadership, of having no diplomatic initiative, and so on. But at the same time, he's also attacked from the right, where the right think he was not hawkish enough. So the criticism is we had these past cycles and he just allowed Hamas to stay rather than being more aggressive. And even now, this criticism focuses on, ironically, even though the US is criticized abroad for being too lenient with Israel, there's the opposite criticism. He lets the American run things. We should just Israel should just be even more aggressive with Gaza, even on the extremes, explicit calls for population transfer, even though the majority of Israelis aren't there. This sort of criticism kind of unifies into the 20-25% who support him are mostly just personalized adherence to his personal leadership and charisma. At this point, he seems at a very low point, but at the same time, we don't know where that's headed yet because there's no elections upcoming, and the polls right now may change and may even incentivize the extreme right to stay in power, to not lose too bitterly right now. I will say another thing on that because it's related to the conversation. Understanding that what we see is a new talking point by Netanyahu right now that tries to divert the conversation from his own personality to the future of the conflict. And he's basically saying everyone else who would take over instead of me would follow the Americans and would initiate a peace process that would lead to a Palestinian state. It would lead to more events like this. This is how the right see this. So that leads him to be even more hawkish and more aggressive in rhetoric so far. The concern is it might lead to even more aggressiveness in the war itself.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your insight. It's truly fascinating to see, to hear from you on the ground, and particularly with all the work that you've been doing as co-investigator with the Peace Index. And as you said, you're just carrying that torch that somebody else in the 90s had kicked off to better understand where people are at with regards to the two-state solution and peace with the Palestinians. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks so much.